Thank you very much, Renee, and I want to thank everybody for coming. This really is quite an extraordinary turnout, and I apologize that we don't have a big enough room. We just didn't know there would be this many people here. But anyway, probably most of you know the background for this. If you don't, I'll describe it briefly, and I think there has been circulated these elaborate outlines I made, and I think on about the page 3 or so, there are these emails, and if you go back to the last of those pages, you can sort of see those from the beginning. But basically what happened is this. Mitch Daniels, who is now the president of the Purdue University system, he was for many years prior to that. He's only had that position for a little over 6 months. Prior to that, he was the governor of the state of Indiana. This past July, Tom Bianco of the Associated Press did some wonderful articles. He had done some investigative reporting. He got a hold of some emails, and he found that in 2010, Mitch Daniels sent off some emails to some of his subordinates inquiring as to whether a book by Howard Zinn called A People's History of the United States, here's one edition of it, he inquired as to whether that might be being used in Indiana classrooms, and if so, he didn't think it should be. We should get rid of it, as he put it. And later, there was an email where it was revealed it was being used in a course at Indiana University. He said, well, this crap shouldn't be accepted, for credit anywhere in the state. How do we get rid of this thing? And so it then emerged that there were some emails showing what book he wanted instead, and that's this book, America, the Last Best Hope by William J. Bennett. This is just volume 1 of it. I think there are 2 other volumes to it. Interestingly, Bennett is not a historian. And I don't say that to denigrate the book. I mean, I'm not saying just because he's not a historian he couldn't write a good history book. But the idea is, he's so concerned about these standards of history, and then the book he wants is not written by a historian, but rather a fellow sort of Republican right-wing politician who served with him in the Reagan administration, for example. All right, so this outline that I handed out, it's a little bit uneven. In some places I've got a lot of things written out in detail. In other places it's just a crude outline. But you can sort of follow along with some of the points I want to make. So the first thing I want to talk about is who was Howard Zinn. And since Mitch Daniels characterized him as anti-American, I thought I'd lead off by pointing out he was a decorated World War II veteran. He volunteered to serve, and he was a bombardier and got many decorations for that. He was a scholar. He wrote over 20 books, and I listed a few of them there. Of course, his most famous one is The People's History of the United States that I already mentioned. But before that, he was probably most known for his work on the civil rights movement in the South. He wrote a book called The Southern Mystique. He wrote another book called SNCC, The New Abolitionists, about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a participant in the civil rights movement, and so he knew the actors and wrote historical works from that standpoint. So he was known for that. He also wrote a lot on social movements in general, including civil disobedience. He wrote a book called Disobedience and Democracy, which was a response to Justice Fortas, what he had written on that subject, and many other books. He wrote a book advocating withdrawal from Vietnam that came out, I want to say, at about 1967. It was the first book of that sort, and it was a historically informed argument. He was trying to use historical information to argue that that was the best thing that should be done. He was also a playwright. He wrote 3 plays. A couple of them were very successful. The third, not so much, but he was doing that as well. He often appeared as an expert witness in important trials. He was an expert, as I said, on social movements and on civil disobedience. So sometimes when people would practice civil disobedience as part of a social movement, he would be brought in as an expert witness and testify. Quite a few famous trials, including the trial of Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret history, a Pentagon history of the Vietnam War. He was a teacher. He started out at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, which was a college for black women. And in fact, that's where he really got started in the civil rights movement. He and his students would go and sit in at segregated lunch counters and be arrested, that sort of thing. And some of his students have become very prominent. Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, and she's written many admiring things about him. Later, he taught at Boston University for many years. That's where I was his student. I was an undergraduate way back in the 1970s. And I took 2 classes from Howard Zinn. I was a philosophy major. He was, of course, a professor of history and political science. But he had a tremendous knowledge of philosophy because the first time I went to see him, I'd written a paper for his class, and he encouraged all of the students to come and talk about the paper. And I came, and I had with me a copy of Plato's Republic because I was going to be going to a philosophy class after that. He said, "Oh, you've got Plato's Republic there. Are you a philosophy major?" And I said, "Yes." And we proceeded to talk about Plato's Republic, and I saw that he knew the book inside and out. Well, in book 7, there's this argument. In book 4, to my knowledge, he's never really written about Plato's Republic, but he was a scholar. He was a learned person. And another time I went to see him, I had a copy of Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason in French because it hadn't been published in English yet, and I was startled that he had read that, and we discussed that. And I don't think he ever wrote about that. So he was an impressive scholar, and I thought he was a very good teacher as well. He had a great sense of humor, very clear. Even his critics, he has lots and lots of critics, as you know if you followed this whole Mitch Daniels thing, because a big part of what Mitch Daniels has done has cited people who have said some very nasty things about Howard Zinn. But one thing that just about everybody agrees on, he was a very clear, very lucid writer, and that transferred into his teaching as well. And he had a wonderful sense of humor. And I'll just give you one. I could give you many examples of his sense of humor. I'll just mention one, that at one point at Boston University there was a strike by the clerical staff and the buildings and grounds workers, and many of the faculty refused to cross the picket line, and Howard Zinn was one of those, and so he taught his classes off campus while the strike was going on. Well, the president of the university, John Silber, he was not a fan of Zinn's. They clashed quite a bit, and so he was looking for an opportunity to fire him. So he selected Zinn and 5 other people and wrote them a letter threatening to fire them. There were lots of other faculty who had also done the same thing, but he left them alone, but he went after Zinn. And so there was a public hearing about this, and Zinn read aloud the letter he had gotten. And it had some language about here, so you face grave consequences which could include termination. And then Howard Zinn said, "It's not clear from this whether they mean to fire us or kill us." So in any case, so that's a little bit about Howard Zinn. I've also listed here some of the awards that he won, and I'll just mention one of them, the Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction, which is given out once a year, and he got like $140,000. It's a pretty big prize, a very prestigious award. All right, so we turn to his book, A People's History of the United States. The book itself has an interesting history. It was published in 1980, and the original print run was 4,000 copies. I mean, Howard Zinn, he'd written a number of books, and they were moderately successful, but no one was expecting this one would be a big seller. So the initial print run was 4,000 copies. Only one ad was ever taken out for the book. To this day, it's only been advertised once. There was a print ad, I think maybe in the New York Review of Books, something like that. And so an amazing thing happened. For well over 20 years, I don't know if it's still true because the information where I got this was a site from several years ago, but as of the first 20 plus years of the publication of the book, it sold more each year than it had the year before. And that's just almost unheard of for a book, for the sales to accelerate like that. So now it's sold more than 2 million copies, which is very rare for a book of history. And I mention that I don't want to make the crude argument that the commercial success of a book proves its merit. I don't want to say that. But you may notice Mitch Daniels characterizes it as way out of the mainstream, this crazy, loony thing that shouldn't be in school. And I think this would be some evidence that it's not quite as out of the mainstream as that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is sort of characterize what's in the book for those who haven't read it. And it's a big, thick book, as you can see. It's some 720-some pages. So I'll just describe a little bit the first chapter, just to give you a flavor of what happens. The first chapter is about Columbus, and it begins rather startlingly. I mean, maybe I should actually open the book a little bit here. Right on the first page of the book, he quotes from Columbus's journal, where Columbus spoke of the Arawaks who came out to greet him and his colleagues. And Columbus wrote as follows: "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And it goes from there. So it talks about Columbus's involvement in the slave trade. The problem is these Arawaks, some of them had some jewelry that had a little bit of gold in it. So he got the idea there must be a huge amount of gold. And so he ordered them to go and get the gold and bring it to him. And then he would give them like some piece of copper jewelry if they brought him some gold. So then if the Arawaks, if any of them were found not with the copper jewelry, one practice that was sometimes done was to cut off their hands so they would bleed to death. And then while he's doing all of this, it's full of language about religion. This is all being done for the glory of God and so forth. And so the emphasis there is very much on the cruelty of Columbus's practices, his involvement in the slave trade, his murdering several of the Arawaks and so forth, which of course is not the usual perspective, at least when I was in school. Maybe things have changed in recent years, but that wasn't the perspective that we got. Now here's an interesting, a really important point to understand to grasp what he's doing in this book. He then goes on to argue, he says, look, he cites Samuel Eliot Morison, a Harvard historian who had written a 500-some page biography of Columbus, which was at one time sort of the standard work. And Morison, of course, the emphasis is on the exploits of Columbus as a sailor, as a navigator, as an explorer, et cetera, et cetera. But Zinn points out that Morison does not completely shy away from this topic. And in fact, he says, this is close to a word-for-word quote from memory, Columbus's cruel practice amounted to genocide. So Morison used the word genocide, which is just about the harshest word you can use. But Zinn makes the point, even though he uses this harsh word genocide, it's sort of buried in the middle of this huge book where the emphasis is all on sort of the good stuff about Columbus. And so Zinn makes the argument that in historical writing, in any kind of narrative writing, it's impossible to include everything. One has to be selective. There has to be omission and emphasis. There's simply no getting around it. And so he says, what is needed then is perhaps a different emphasis as a corrective to the existing historical texts. So he's going to pay attention to things like Columbus's involvement in the slave trade. Now, that leads people like Daniels to say, oh, he's anti-American, he hates his country. And part of the response that Zinn makes is to say, because he anticipates that criticism, he says, it's true, I'm going to point out some nasty things about some people who have been regarded as heroes, but by the same token, I can maybe introduce you to some new heroes. So he mentions this, I want to say his name is Las Casas, there it is, who wrote the book, The History of the Indies. And he was one who documented what Columbus did and very much protested against it, and he's not as well known. So here's somebody we can admire perhaps more. So anyway, that's just a little bit about what the book is like. So that's Columbus, and as the book proceeds, he quite often sort of debunks the traditional history which glorifies the activities of presidents and other leaders, and he puts more attention on, artists and people who lead rebellion. Frederick Douglass rather than Abraham Lincoln as the hero for the elimination of slavery, that kind of thing. All right, so that's a little bit about what Zinn's book is like. Now let's go to Mitch Daniels and what he has to say about it. And you can look at those emails you go in a couple of pages and you can see those. And the first point I want to make is that he doesn't offer any kind of evidence, argument, or reasoning when he makes these harsh judgments about Zinn's book. And one thing I want to say, and I realize that when I say this, I may come across as sounding fanatical and immoderate and lacking in the proper measure. So I want to try to really make a case for this. I'm going to argue that what he says about Zinn fails to live up to the standards that we demand of freshman students. That's how bad it is. Now that sounds so very extreme, and it sounds like, oh, you know, surely that must show some horrible bias on my part, but I want to really document that. So, I mean, one of the things we do ask of our freshman students, if they're going to criticize some text, I mean, you've got to engage with the text. You've got to say, well, look, he says this thing, which is incorrect for this reason. Here's the evidence. You can't just do a bunch of name calling. I mean, let's look at how that starts off. I'm looking here at the email. This terrible anti-American academic finally passed away. The obits and commentaries mention that his book, A People's History of the United States, is the textbook of choice in high schools and colleges around the country. It is a truly execrable, anti-factual piece of disinformation that misstates American history on every page. And then his other comments are along the same line. So there's never any argument ever offered, no evidence is offered, no reasoning is offered. You just have this name calling and these sort of summary judgments. And so I say here, what kinds of intellectual standards are these? Now, you might argue it's unfair to make the comparison to our freshman students because he's not writing a paper, he's talking to his subordinates, Tony Bennett and people like that. But then you sort of wonder about the organizational dynamic. Why does no one raise any questions? I mean, my colleagues here in the faculty, we've all served on committees where we talk about things we're going to do, and typically you get a group of people and they all have brains. When somebody comes up with a thing like this, there's going to be some discussion. There's going to be, well, why do you want to do that? What's the evidence for it? You know, and notice this doesn't happen. You know, no one says, well, wouldn't this be kind of extraordinary, Mitch? You're not a historian. You know, you're the governor. For you to sort of come in here and just sort of say you want to disqualify various courses and texts, that's kind of an extraordinary thing. Tell us, Mitch, tell us a little, what is it in this? No, they all just go right along. They sort of jump on the bandwagon. So we have to ask what was going on there in the state of Indiana. And of course, he's brought a lot of those people with him into the government at Purdue. He's been criticized for that, and he's said, well, we don't want to keep out superstars just because they've served in government, you know. So we've got some of these same people. So I say in here, you know, none of them asked such questions as this. If the book were really that bad, how had it become, quote, the textbook of choice in high schools and colleges around the country? That seems like kind of an obvious question. None of them asked why the judgment of Daniels, who is not a historian, should be assumed to be superior to that of history professors and other teachers who specialize in teaching history. And then, of course, we can see the possibility that this is mostly political. Zinn was a leftist. Mitch Daniels is very much politically on the right. The book that he favors, not by a historian, somebody else on the political right. So it might be more that rather than a great concern for rigorous academic standards. So then some of the, if you look on the web, I've run off hundreds of articles from the web because I'm so interested in this, and there are quite a few people who defend Mitch Daniels. And one of the things they say, well, isn't it admirable that he's so concerned about education? Here he is a governor, and he's concerned about education, and I agree with that. It's a good thing to be concerned about education, so I applaud him for being concerned. But notice he pursues that concern in an autocratic, undemocratic way. He doesn't say, let's start a conversation on this. Let's bring in those who use Zinn and ask why they do it. What do they accomplish with this? I can state my objections and see if they can answer them. Let's see who are the sort of proper authorities to sort of go. No, it's nothing like that. He just makes the decision right off this is crap, get rid of it. Find a way to do it. Go for it. Disqualify it. This is what he says. So a very sort of undemocratic, autocratic kind of procedure. I like to say, I'm not usually accused of modesty. I've got a fairly healthy self-regard, but I've got opinions about what books should be used, but I can't imagine myself behaving this way. See, here's some professor who's using a book I don't think is in it. Ban it. Get rid of it. It's crap. You know, I mean, it's like you want to talk. Why do you want to use? You want to sort of talk to them, get the reasoning. So I think that's very troubling. And then I point out on here, I've looked at. I can't say that I've read the whole thing, but I've read a good bit of this book, Mitch Daniels' Keeping the Republic, Saving America by Trusting Americans. And one of the things he says in there is he talks a lot about government experts who are regulators. He says, you know, they're regulating almost every aspect of our lives. And he comes up with a term that he likes. He calls them our benevolent betters, which he uses sort of sarcastically. And the rhetorical point is, we Americans, we're good people of common sense. We know what we're doing. But there are all these do-gooders, in Washington who think they have to regulate everything. If they just leave us alone and let us do our thing, we'd be much better off. And so then I ask the question, how can he square that with what he's doing here? It seems like his position ought to be, oh yeah, the good history teachers of Indiana, they know what they're doing. Isn't he behaving like a benevolent better? He's in government, he knows better, he knows what books should be used. All right. Also, I had a point in here that in that initial email he uses the word force feeding. He says, can someone assure me that this book is not in use anywhere in Indiana? If it is, how do we get rid of it before any more young people are force-fed? A totally false version of our history. Well, why assume that it's going to be force-feeding? Why can't it be a rational and critical engagement, with this text rather than force-feeding? So it shows, I think, a rather dubious understanding of what education is and how it works. Okay, I'm not going to go through every point on this outline, so I'm going to skip a little bit here. All right, let's look at some of the later statements that he made following the disclosure of these emails. And one of the things that's really interesting is he has denied on more than one occasion that he was doing anything that in any way threatened academic freedom or that constituted censorship. So if you look here, unfortunately I didn't paginate these, I'm sorry about that, but this part 3, later statements following the disclosure of the emails, it comes shortly after the pages that have the emails. There's a statement that was posted on the Purdue's website, which I think has since been removed because I found it right away when it happened and I haven't been able to go back to it. So I think it's been taken down. I could be wrong. But in any case, he says there, quote, "In truth, my emails infringed on no one's academic freedom and proposed absolutely no censorship of any person or viewpoint. In fact, the question I asked on one day in 2010 had nothing to do with higher education at all. I merely wanted to make certain that Howard Zinn's textbook, which represents a falsified version of history, was not being foisted upon our young people in Indiana's public K-12 classrooms." And so then he called the AP report unfair and erroneous. And the Board of Trustees just backed him completely. The Board of Trustees issued a statement saying this, "What we see is a complete misrepresentation of President Daniels' views and concerns. The exchange had nothing to do with academic freedom or censorship. Rather, it had to do with concerns over what is being taught in Indiana's K-12 public schools." Well, let me just comment on that. Notice what a complete non sequitur that is. It had nothing to do with academic freedom or censorship. He was just concerned about what's being taught in the schools. Well, look, what motivates censors quite often is concern about what's being taught in the schools, at any rate. The board rejects as totally misleading the original article and reaffirms its unanimous and complete support of President Daniels. And then, as some of you may know, a group of 90-some, I've forgotten the exact number, somewhere between 90 and 100, Purdue faculty members wrote a letter to him sort of protesting this whole Zinn business. And so in Daniels' reply, one of the things he said is he asked his critics to, quote, "Please note all that did not happen. Zinn's book was not removed from any K-12 classrooms because apparently none were using it, and no change of any kind occurred with regard to the summer class for K-12 teachers. Its participants received credit and would today if the class was still offered. Most important, no one tried to censor anyone's right to express any opinion they might hold. As many others have observed, this was a careless and inappropriate use of that inflammatory word." So the way I've tried to debunk this, it's just incredibly simple. I simply went to the dictionary and looked at what these words mean. So here we've got it. Academic freedom. I found a definition in Encyclopedia Britannica. The freedom of teachers and students to teach, study, and pursue knowledge and research without unreasonable interference or restriction from law, institutional regulations, or public pressure. Its basic elements include the freedom of teachers to inquire into any subject that evokes their intellectual concern, to present their findings to their students, colleagues, and others, to publish their data and conclusions without control or censorship, and to teach in the manner they consider professionally appropriate. For students, the basic elements include the freedom to study subjects that concern them and to form conclusions for themselves and express their opinions. Now, it seems to me nothing more need to be said to refute the contention that his actions had nothing to do with academic freedom, and it had to do with interfering with exactly that. And then similarly with regard to censorship, I guess I won't bother to read the definitions here because you've got them there. But I guess the central sort of conceptual point I would make, and by the way, Daniels isn't the only one to make this. I swear I've seen a dozen people who have written things on the web saying it's outrageous that they accused him of censorship because, you know, censorship, that's when you like burn books or take them out of the library or something like that. And so they don't realize that there are varying degrees of censorship. If you look at the definition, it refers to the suppression of ideas that one finds objectionable. And so if someone wants to include something in a textbook and some government official says, no, we're going to remove that, that's the suppression of information, the suppression of ideas, even if the information is still available in the public library. It's not an all or nothing thing. There are degrees of censorship. And then part of his argument also seems to be that, well, he doesn't come out and say it this boldly, but he implies it. He's saying, well, look, I didn't infringe on anyone's academic freedom or censor anything because after all, nothing was ever done. This was all just talk. And so that's sort of interesting. That's sort of like somebody who orders a hit on someone and then the hitman never does it and the person doesn't follow through. See, I never killed anybody. I mean, admittedly, that's an outrageous analogy because he did, you know, we're not talking about murder. But the fact that nothing was done, I think, doesn't change the fact that he did order for things. He said, go for it, disqualify propaganda, and so forth. And there are several other things about this that are kind of interesting. He has said on more than one occasion, oh, we found that the book was not being used in Indiana classrooms. And, well, that just shows something about the competence of the people who are doing this investigation. Because one of the courses I teach is called Critical Thinking, and one of the textbooks I use has a chapter on history textbooks. And so I always talk about this subject with my students. And that book makes a point sort of similar to Zinn's. It argues that history textbooks in the public schools tend to be very much sanitized. They make our leaders, they play up the good stuff, they play down the bad stuff, and so on. And so I'll ask my students, well, is this, you know, it's been a long time since I was in public school, is this what it's like? And most of them say yes, but every semester there'll be 4 or 5 who say, well, yeah, except we read Howard Zinn's book in my class. So every semester 4 or 5 people from Indiana will say that. And I've talked to other people where they've been told the same thing. And then, now admittedly that's anecdotal, but there's a website called the Howard Zinn Education Project. And so they had a quote on this too, which I'll read here. It's in your outline. Governor Daniels' advisors evidently found no evidence that Zinn's A People's History of the United States was in use in K-12 schools in Indiana. I guess they didn't look hard enough. There are more than 300 Indiana teachers registered at the Zinn education process to access People's History curriculum materials, and these are only the teachers who have formally registered at the site. And then another point about this, I didn't fill this out very much on the outline, but I found another place where he made an interesting sort of argument. He's trying to reassure the faculty, and he says, I assure you I'm in favor of academic freedom, so if Howard Zinn were a tenured professor at Purdue University, I would leave him alone. He could teach whatever he wanted. He could publish whatever he wanted. Rest assured, you know, I'm not going to mess with him. This is what he says. But then he goes on to say, but that does not give one the right to have one's books used in classroom. Being a tenured professor doesn't give you that right. Now, that's true, it doesn't, but it's kind of an irrelevant point because no one said that it does give you that right. So again, let me give you an analogy. It's as if Mitch were to come to my house and steal a guitar from my house and then say, being a tenured professor doesn't give you the right to have a guitar. And you say, yeah, it's not in my capacity as a tenured professor that it's my guitar. It's because I bought it with my own money. That's what makes it mine. So that's sort of the relevant issue. So similarly, the question of whether a book should be used in the classroom from the standpoint of academic freedom at a university is because the teacher selected it. So if you're going to mess with that, it's not that you're violating the rights of the person who wrote the book. You're violating the rights of the professor who wants to assign it. So again, it's not a cogent argument. Continuing on, how can it be seriously maintained that Daniels' emails, quote, had nothing to do with higher education at all? Well, his initial email in which he asked whether this book was being used mentioned both colleges and K through 12 and did not draw a distinction between them. And then the only specific course that was ever discussed was a college course offered at Indiana University. Now, to be fair to Daniels, I actually am trying to be fair to Daniels, as hard as that is to believe. He does sort of explain it, because he says, well, but this was a course for teachers. It was taught at a university, but it's for teachers who would be teaching in K through 12. But see, when you say that, you're opening up, you're kind of opening up a can of worms, because it sounds very firm to say, oh yeah, it's nothing to do with higher education, do what you want. And I would, well, unless the higher education classes have implications for K through 12, we're starting to carve out exceptions to this. So I just want to point that out. And also I mentioned on here, when Tom LaBianco went to this press conference to ask him this very question. And how can you say it has nothing to do with higher education when that's what you were focusing on? He didn't answer the question, and neither would the spokespeople answer that. Then there's all sorts of stuff about Purdue politics that are very troubling. I mean, I find that statement by the Board of Trustees just really hard to fathom, that they could just swallow all these things that a 10-year-old can see through. I mean, this claim that it had nothing to do with censorship and had nothing to do with academic freedom. Well, some of you know the background for this. 8 of the 10 people on the Board of Trustees were appointed by Mitch Daniels. There's a question about whether this is legal. In Indiana, there's a so-called cooling off rule that bars executive branch employees from seeking employment with organizations that do business with the state. Anybody can see why. You don't have to be someone who teaches, political philosophy to see the political problems with that. And so also, the deliberations are supposed to be public. There's a transparency law on that. So there have been newspapers that have inquired. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that he was selected to be the president. A survey was done of all the major constituencies of the university, administrators, faculty, staff, students. What do they want in a president? All constituencies said a very important consideration is they wanted the new president to be someone with significant academic qualifications, like our previous President Francis Cordova, who was an astrophysicist. He, of course, doesn't have these, Mitch Daniels. So in any case, people have been interested, well, how did this happen? What were the deliberations like? So there have been newspapers like the Lafayette Journal and Courier who filed a complaint. They wanted to get access to this, and saying, doesn't this violate the state's open meetings law? They had an executive session at an undisclosed location in Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Well, the state's public access counselor is someone who makes that rule, and he says no, just simply knowing that the meeting would happen at the out-of-state location was open enough. So that's okay. Now, take a guess. Who do you think appointed that person? So that's how this works. Okay, now let's look at the criticisms of Zinn, such as they are, because finally, after the emails were disclosed, he does finally get around to offering, I guess I'd say 2 criticisms are the ones I can find. And the first one comes under the heading of appeal to authority. He sent an email to reporters on July 17th in which he said, "No one need take my word that my concerns about Zinn were well-founded. Respected scholars and communicators of all ideologies agree that the work of Howard Zinn was irredeemably slanted and unsuited for teaching to school children." And so then he quotes some nasty things that some people have said about Zinn, several historians here. And you can read those on your own. For reasons of time, I'll skip ahead. So the main problem with appeals to authority, in fact, in my critical thinking class, we're talking about logical fallacies. We dealt with the issue of appeal to authority quite recently. Appeals to authority aren't always fallacious. I mean, there are situations in which one isn't in a position to evaluate evidence directly, so there can be times when it's reasonable to subordinate one's own judgment to that of trusted authorities. But in general, logicians have always thought it's an inferior kind of argument because it sort of raises as many questions as it answers. What determines the truth about something is a rational appraisal of the relevant evidence. And so if you're going to not do that, but instead go by, well, here's what some people said, then you have to worry, well, did they come to that conclusion in the right way? Did they base it on an accurate appraisal of the relevant evidence or not? So it's sort of, in principle, a fairly weak argument to appeal to authority. But I mean, one can go much further. That's sort of the general thing. But the biggest problem with it, and the Purdue faculty who wrote that reply to Daniels made this point, is that he simply left out the fact that there are other prominent authorities who praise Howard Zinn. And they mentioned, and I will too, probably the most prominent one is Eric Foner. He wrote the original review of the People's History of the United States in the New York Times. It wasn't a completely fawning review, but certainly it was overall a quite favorable one. And one of the things he had said was that Zinn's chapter on the Vietnam War should be, quote, required reading for a new generation of students. Now, who's Eric Foner? I got some information on here. So he was president of all three major professional organizations in the field of history: the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Society for American Historians. He's a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize. And I point out he got these prizes and honors after praising Zinn. So evidently, his colleagues didn't think that was a sign of incompetence. They elected him to these positions. And then he continued to praise Zinn. He wrote an article about him in 2010, renewing his praise for Zinn. Also, I mention here, two other historians have written admiring biographies of Zinn. These are Martin Duberman, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at the SUNY Graduate Center. He's a Bancroft Prize winner, recipient of the American Historical Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. Davis D. Joyce, Professor Emeritus of History at East Central University. And if you do a web search about this whole controversy, you'll find there are quite a few other historians who have come to Howard Zinn's defense. And then I also make the point here, look, this is a really easy thing to do. Any prominent writer, any prominent intellectual, if you want to use an appeal to authority kind of argument, you can trawl around and find several people who will say nasty things about them. So, for example, in this book, Keeping the Republic, in the introduction by George F. Will, he talks about how Mitch Daniels had made a list of his favorite books, and I noticed they included books by Milton Friedman and Frederick Hayek, two economists. And so I did a web search of harsh criticism of Milton Friedman, and right away I found something by an economist who said every prediction he's ever made was wrong, and then another one that said every public policy he's ever been helpful in implementing has been disastrous. So you can do this for anybody, any prominent intellectual, prominent writer. They've got professional detractors who will say very harsh things. So for Daniel to say, you don't have to take my word, I found 4 or 5 other historians who say he's awful, that doesn't really prove very much. And I might also mention, I can't find any evidence anywhere in here that Mitch Daniels has ever read Howard Zinn. Because if you think about it, originally it's all this name-calling, and then after that what you've got is, oh, look at what these other people say. And you may know there's this whole sort of cottage industry of right-wing sort of websites and books where they sort of keep track of left-wing academics and sort of compile nasty stuff about them. And this is sort of all in that sort of boilerplate. They've all got these sort of same quotes. And when people try to say he gets some things wrong in his book, it's always the same, 6 or 7 examples that just get recirculated. None of them can be bothered to sort of read through the book and actually make a fresh and original comment. So, I mean, I can't prove that he's never read it, but I'm just saying there's no evidence here that he ever did. And in any case, getting back to this thing about the appeal to authority, it ended up backfiring on him. You can see here I've cited this article by John K. Wilson that has the headline, "The Historians Cited by Mitch Daniels Denounce Him." So 3 of the people that Daniels cited as, these are people who say Zinn is terrible, they've come forward and say, hey, I don't like my stuff being used that way. And so I won't read through all of these. Michael Kazin said Daniels, quote, should be roundly condemned for his attempts to stop students from reading Zinn's big book and for calling Zinn a liar. I think what he means by that is Daniels didn't just say, Zinn got it wrong. He says, he's sort of a deliberate fraud. He says things like that a couple of times. And then Sam Weinberg said, Mitch Daniels uses my work to defend his shameless attempts to censor free speech. Shame. And then Michael Kamen says similar things. I won't keep reading, but he did this as well. I've also got here the American Historical Association released a statement condemning Daniels, so that's a major association of historians. There's also a plagiarism issue. I won't go through all of that. You've got that on here. It's not a major plagiarism issue because it's only a few words, but you can see here Mitch Daniels, a statement that he made on well, I'm not sure on what date here. You know what, I'm not going to go through this because it's kind of complicated, but the main thing is that it's got this phrase, a heavily filtered and weighted interpretation, and how this becomes dangerous when we're talking about how we educate the young, those who not get the interpretive game. And that phrase, a heavily filtered and weighted interpretation, comes from somebody else's work, and it's in context of the same, in reference to the same other quotation that goes next to it. So it looks pretty obvious that it was lifted from somewhere. Now, if it were me, I've got a pretty harsh penalty for plagiarism. I wouldn't do much with this because it's so short, but I'd at least say to the student, hey, you know, you got this from somebody else, you should footnote this. Daniels was confronted with this, and here's his reply. Look, if there's anything I do, I write my own stuff. All of it, I always have. Again, would we accept that from a freshman student? If they came up and it had like a 5-word phrase. Now, the one thing, it said something like, oh, Zinn, he's a fraud. Okay, 2 people might think of that. But I don't think 2 people would come up with the phrase, where was that now? Heavily filtered and weighted interpretation. That's kind of an odd phrase, and especially it fits right next to other stuff that's in the 2 quotations. And so just say, oh, you know, I didn't do it. Maybe we think alike, Daniel said. Okay, now the biggest thing, I'll skip the Lysenkoism analogy stuff just for reasons of time. The biggest thing here is this business of objectivity, and I find this the most intellectually dishonest thing of all here. In Daniel's reply to the faculty, it included the following statement, which is also in the abstract that I gave you. One of many faculty members who wrote me supportive messages pointed out that Professor Zinn's disdain for the idea of objective truth went far beyond American history. In his essay, The Uses of Scholarship, Professor Zinn criticized disinterested scholarship, objective study, and the scientific method across the disciplines, thus attacking the foundations of Purdue's entire research enterprise, end quote. Now, here's what I want to say about this. If you read that someone has attacked objective truth, attacked the scientific method, anyone would wonder, what did they mean by that? You know, that's kind of interesting. What do they mean by objective truth? What do they? And Howard Zinn has talked about this in like 15 of his books. He talks about this all the time. And every time he talks about it, he says, I have these criticisms of objectivity. People are going to wonder what that means. Let me explain what that means. And he proceeds to go on and qualify it. And, of course, Daniels doesn't go into any of that. And so he invites the reader to think, oh, Zinn is just saying, there's no such thing as objectivity, so I can just throw out my propaganda and my bias and my political slant and everything. And, of course, he goes out of his way to say that's not what he's saying. So let me talk about this. Let's go back to the thing about Samuel Eliot Morison on Columbus. One thing that Zinn is saying about objectivity is you can't describe everything that happens. You have to be selective. That journalists have to be selective, historians have to be selective, so you need some criteria. What are you going to include? What are you going to leave out? What are you going to emphasize? What are you going to play down? And so that's one of the things that Zinn means by denying objectivity. He says if you mean by objective that I'm including everything, or that what I'm including or not including isn't colored by any value consideration, yeah, I reject that. That's very different from rejecting the scientific method. He never says anything like that. And he goes out of his way to say, of course, whatever you're doing, you have to be accurate. You can't get it wrong. You've got to get the measurements right. You can't make an argument and then leave out the evidence that goes against it and so on. Daniels mentions none of that and invites you to think that that's not there. Invites you to think he's this wild man who just says, you know, I can say whatever I want. Moreover, there's sort of more to this. Part of the essay that Daniel cites is The Uses of Scholarship, although notice, he doesn't tell you that he's read it himself. He says, one of many faculty members who wrote me supportive messages pointed out, so again, he's relying on what other people are telling him. The context of that essay, which was written back in like 1969 or 1970, is Zinn is arguing that scholars should take a stand on the issues of the day. But because of the idea of objectivity, because of the idea of disinterested scholarship, they deliberately stay away from that. So he gives an example. The Vietnam War is going on. There's a meeting of the American Asian scholars, and they have all kinds of sessions about things that happened long in the past, but not a single session about the Vietnam War. So you'd think specialists in Asian history, Asian studies, they would have valuable information pertinent to the debate about the Vietnam War. But there's this idea, if I say something about the Vietnam War, then I'm taking a stand on something controversial and political, so that's not being a scholar. And Zinn wants to say that's an insane view of what scholarship is. If scholarship is going to have any value, we should be able to learn from it and apply it to pressing issues. And if you say, oh, here's someone who made an argument that takes a stand, therefore it's not objective, well, that's crazy. You can't learn anything that way. To know whether it's objective in sort of the good sense, you want to know, is it respectful of evidence? Is the argument cogent? Was there anything important left out that would go against it? That sort of thing. So that idea just means we can never learn anything. So one of the analogies that Zinn uses, and I think this is a good way to get a grasp on what he's saying about objectivity, consider medical research. He says medical researchers are not neutral about the relative value of health and sickness. They're for health and against sickness, and that guides their research. They're trying to combat disease and promote health. And he makes the point that in no way hinders their research. If anything, it aids it. It focuses it. It gives them a sense of what to look for. And so there's no reason why historians can't do that as well. Moreover, if what we mean by objectivity is something like not being overly parochial, being sort of more universal and inclusive, then his approach to objectivity is more objective than the original approach for this reason. He says, I think the values we should be guided by are these basic universal values, values of truth, justice, honesty, compassion, fairness, anti-racism, anti-war, things of that nature. And he says, well, what happens with a lot of traditional scholarship and traditional history textbooks is the values are more narrow and parochial, such as patriotic ones. Our country is a great country. And in fact, this book by William J. Bennett that Daniels wants to use, he says right in the introduction, one of the reasons for writing the book is I want to restore sort of pride in America and so forth. And so Zinn makes the point, let's go back to the medical research, if what you're guided by is a kind of universal value, like you're for health and against sickness, that's going to give you no motivation to fudge your research. You want to acknowledge when you've got a cure and when you don't, for example. But if you want to show, if your fundamental values are something like America's the greatest country on earth, then you've got this motive to fudge it whenever the data don't support that. So I think, in fact, his approach will lead to greater objectivity. So I can just almost not stand it, how unfair this is. It's sort of had this quote, oh, Zinn, he says we can just get rid of objectivity, get rid of the scientific method. It's so unfair. Again, it's not intellectual standards we would accept from a freshman. We really wouldn't. Look, he put all those qualifications and explanations in it. If you're going to condemn that, you have to quote those and address those and argue against those. You can't pretend they're not there. Okay, so where does this leave us? I'll just say maybe one or two other things about this business of objectivity, and then and maybe let it go at that. One is Zinn has this idea that one reason why this traditional notion of objectivity has prevailed is that it ends up supporting the status quo. And he makes it clear he's not advancing that as a conspiracy theory. It's not like anybody thought, hey, look, if we teach all these scholars to be objective, it's going to support what we're doing. He gives a kind of natural selection kind of argument. And see, the way this works is, if you are using your scholarship to argue for some kind of radical change, if you're doing it to sort of criticize the way things are done, then everybody, oh, look, you've got a political agenda. You're biased. You've got all these values. Whereas if what you're doing doesn't do that, a lot of people just see it as there are no values at all. They don't recognize it as you're supporting the status quo. So, for example, if you are teaching students how to fit in the business world and adopt the ethics of the business world. You know, then people, well, then you don't have any values, you don't have any agenda. But if you want to say, look, there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in the business world, there's a lot of lying that goes on in advertising, you know, et cetera, now it looks like you've sort of got this agenda. And Zinn wants to say, look, there are values either way. It's just a pretense to think there is not. So again, this wouldn't be a conspiracy, but it's like one reason why the status quo isn't opposing this sort of traditional notion of objectivity, is it ends up supporting the status quo. And so then the last point I'll make is just about the issue of politics and scholarship and teaching. A lot of people in Mitch Daniels' camp, most notably David Horowitz, I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, they've got this idea that there just shouldn't be any political content in university teaching. That if any professor brings up anything political, man, that's an infringement on the academic freedom of the students. And I think what Zinn would say about this, and I think I would agree with this, is that might be true if the subject really is apolitical. If you're taking a statistics class or something like that, if the teacher starts ranting about socialism or something, you know, that's probably going to be inappropriate. But if you're studying history or political science or philosophy or economics, I mean, that's full of political content. And so there should be a full and free exchange of political ideas where people from all sorts of political stripes are welcome. And so I would make the analogy to scientists. I'll close on this point. You know, scientists are not objective in the sense of not taking a stand. When a scientist, writes something, they're usually arguing, look, how about this? I'll go back to medical research. You've got, at one point there was a lot of dispute about what is the cause of AIDS. Some people thought it was the HIV virus, some people thought it was something else. So these scientists, they're doing their research and coming to their conclusion, and then they argue for it. And they give their evidence and they give their protocol so other people can duplicate their experience. It's not like, oh, I'm not going to take a position. What's the use of it if you don't take a position? You've got to sort of argue, I'm marshaling my evidence, here's what it is. Other people can argue another way. And so there's nothing unscholarly about taking a stand on political issues. What makes it unscholarly is if it's not done in a logical way, it's not done in a way that's responsive to the relevant facts and evidence, if it ignores counter evidence, and so on. I think I will conclude on that note, and thank you very much for listening. I do appreciate it. Gideon.
Topics that you covered in my perspective. There is a conflict between Mitch Daniels and the academic community, or at least some of it, and there is Howard Zinn's philosophy about the use of scholarship.
Yes.
I would like a future session as a university to focus on the uses of scholarship. Just focus on that and discuss it, especially as applied to this campus, because I believe that on this campus we are unbelievably apathetic.
Apathetic?
Yes. We are not get involved in anything that touches politics, because that's too dangerous.
Yeah.
It's like the taboos. You can't talk religion, and therefore you can't talk politics.
Right.
We can talk politics on this campus, and we should try and take the rules, the 5 rules that Howard Zinn is presenting, and discuss it, and what do we believe in, and what potential action we could take, so that it relates to the real life and to the real issues that we confront in our society.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. That'd be interesting. Yes, please.
My name is Diane Perry, and I'm not a scholar. I came because I saw it in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
A retired public school teacher and a retired journalist, and it was a dual career, so it's not like I had 30 years back to back. It was 30 years both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I also served as a consultant of the DOE in the area of language arts back before Tony Bennett, back when it was a little more data-driven. And just some of the things I wanted to point out to students. When I'm a child of the 60s, and I was advised not to go into social studies because it was female, and because those jobs were set aside for coaches. Coaches got fired, they had to go from school to school to school. And they, public school systems kept those positions open for coaches in Indiana. So one of the reasons that mythology gets passed on is because people who are very busy with a couple of other agendas have a tendency to revert to how they were taught. So that's, if you had a really good public school teacher who was a coach, like thinking particularly Kirk Whiting at River Forest, who gave up coaching because he felt he couldn't really teach history to the extent he wanted to. The other thing I want to point out is how textbooks for high school are selected. You cannot have a book selected if it hasn't passed through Texas and passed through California because of the sheer need to make a profit on selling that textbook. Those are huge states.
Right.
And if you think of how what cannot be in a textbook in Texas, you can see why you might be a little concerned coming out of the public school system. On the other hand, with access to the internet and with access to all the materials that come with textbooks today, students have access to prime sources. And that's one of the things that you failed to mention, is that the book that gives his prime sources is as big as the People's History of the United States itself. In other words, you're totally free as a student here at Purdue to look at the other book and go, well, he read this about Columbus. I can read the same thing about Columbus, and maybe I will come to a different conclusion.
Right. Yeah.
So you can go back to original sources. However, with Mitch's $330 million cut to public education, most school teachers were not able to buy into anything except the basic textbook. They were not. They did not have the money to buy the DVDs and the codes that got you into all of that stuff. So there are a lot of issues surrounding social studies teaching in Indiana, and I just wanted to point out some of those.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Hello, Professor, everybody. My name is Ron Harlow. I am a Highland graduate. My master's degree right here. My last class was with Professor Gideon Falk right there. And I'm a Chicago comic, as well as doing a radio show on a station down the street here, WJOB. And I talk about Howard Zinn a lot on my show. Not a lot, but enough to say that it interests me a great deal, and I'm going to talk about it on today's show at 4 o'clock. And I don't know if you guys have any time. If you have any time to join me, again, it's blocked from where we're standing. If I'm not, are you here, Professor? Or?
I am. I'm a Purdue Calumet.
Well, you know where we're at then. And I could really use one of those outlines, because I did not get one. And,
I don't think I have any more. Does anybody? Are there any more out there? Okay, it looks like. Oh, you got one. Okay. Okay.
I'm on from 4 to 6 weekdays. It's a fun show. I have comedians from all over the world, SNL, people that Chicago's a really mecca for comedy.
Thank you.
And I got a chance to meet everybody. Good.
Yes, sir.
Dan Cooper, I have a comment about what you said about science and working towards some sort of universal good as a better standard of objectivity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of personal benefit that goes into scientific research, especially in terms of medicine and supporting health and going against sickness. An example of that, I believe, is all the drugs that are pulled off of the market after they're released 10 years out, and finally the Food and Drug Administration determines that they don't do what they're supposed to do. So that...
Louder, please.
Oh, sorry. From the beginning? The Food and Drug Administration pulls some of the drugs that have been released off of the market. I think that that's good evidence that personal gain has clouded that objectivity.
Oh yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that medical research is pure. I'm just saying that in principle, no one objects to the idea that medical researchers would be driven by a positive interest in health and a negative interest in sickness. Now, they sometimes deviate from that because they want to get rich. I agree with you. But see, there's this idea in history, if you do that, if someone uses historical evidence, I mean, what do we mean by historical evidence? Let me give an example. Like Howard Zinn, one of the places where he uses that is he talked about the American intervention in Nicaragua in the 1980s. and how this was justified on the grounds that supposedly there was a communist threat coming from there. And so then Zinn proceeds to show that the same thing had happened 3 or 4 times prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, exactly the same kind of behavior, which would, he says, that doesn't prove that that wasn't the real motivation, but it strongly suggests it. So that's one way you can use historical research to argue about something else that's going on right now. People will say, oh, here's why we're doing something, here's what the motive is, and you can test that by seeing, well, what's been the policy, you know, in other circumstances where that motive couldn't have been in place. So whether you buy that argument or not, that's just an illustration. So the idea that one might engage in historical research for the purpose of trying to determine how one should think about some issue of contemporary interest, that doesn't mean it's going to be bad scholarship. And I was just trying to use the example of medical research to show that.
Okay.
Yeah. Please.
I been at university, retired now, but I was a university professor for 40 years, European history. One of the first things, I've been a university professor for 40 years, and one of the first things I tell my students is it's not important only what you know, but how do you know what you know? How do you know what you know? Where did you get it? Who told you that information? It's surprising how many people believe what they were told in kindergarten or the first grade, and you can't tell them anything to persuade them. And one of the examples, since you mentioned Morrison's book.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Morrison's book on Columbus. There's still people, I don't know how many in this room, but certainly I heard it enough. I just heard it on television a few weeks ago, who believe that when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, people in Europe thought that the world was flat.
Right.
Morrison debunks that on his first page.
Yeah. I mean, that's been debunked over and over again, but people still believe it. You're right. Did I see a hand back here? Yes, sir.
I mean, well, for, the argument of adolescence, I mean, it's safe to say that anything that you're told as you're young, you're going to believe because you expect it to be the truth, not more so of a patriotic strategy. I mean, it seems to me like that the argument right now is basically whether a scholar should seek objectivity as far as the definition of looking for the truth, in the pursuit of the truth, of what really happened versus what is going to protect the, I guess, falsehood or gilded, integrity of the origin of a country.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like.
Yep, I agree. Saul.
One of the things that I think is especially appropriate and interesting about the book, it is a people's history, and the general gist of the book is the United States really ought to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and not a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich.
Yeah.
For all practical purposes, the problem that Zinn identifies consistently is the coalescence between corporate wealth and government. And I think for that reason, the issue becomes all the more relevant under the current economic circumstances, which raise questions about precisely that issue of the association of wealth with government and politics, and the undermining of politics as a consequence.
And indeed. And if I could just point out for those of you who don't know, Saul Lerner is a historian. So thank you, Saul. There you go. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Please.
For the young man back here, the victors write the history books.
Yeah.
And to that extent, history is in a crisis in this country, in the sense that who will survive politically in this polarized situation will determine what the history of our country will look like. It's already in the secondary education textbooks, just the basic text itself. But I think that adolescents can be taught to discern fact from fiction. can be taught to discern that, and it's incumbent upon public school teachers to teach them that this is an advertisement, this is an article, you know, and that this is a press release from the drug company, and this is, and yet, because if you don't have these skills, you know, you're on Fox.
Well, then you're on Fox because the foundation is skewed. It's like a pyramid upside down. You don't learn these things until you know, advance and get older and mature, as well as, you know, succeed in your education. Because, you know, you're not taught to seek out evidence.
Why aren't you taught to seek out evidence? Seventh graders can do it. The only skill that takes some intellectual maturity is understanding satire. That requires a brain that is at a little bit higher developmental level, just biologically, than understanding what a non sequitur argument
Sure.
is.
Let me hear from Robin, and then you're next, ma'am. Go ahead.
I appreciate what you said about the seventh graders can do it. You inadvertently enshrined one of the problems with young people doing it when you said that history is written by the victors or the winners. No, that's the fight we're in the middle of now in what book will be accepted. The victors have by no means won. History is based on the testimony or writings, in the case where they can write, of eyewitnesses. Notoriously unreliable, and it's an ongoing problem with teaching what really happened and learning how to evaluate. That is the problem in learning history, learning how to evaluate it. It's hard for young people to do that because they're the losers. They're smaller and more ignorant, presumably, hopefully, than the people who are teaching them. So the argument to authority, unfortunately, is enshrined in that characterization of history. It's written by the winners, and those of us who don't feel like beating up all the winners at once have to go along with that, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, except I think the battle has shifted to the, has been lost, 80% lost at the secondary level.
Oh, I
And
agree
is
with you.
shifting now to the college, you see. This represents it.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm an instructor in sociology here, and just a word about the benefit of the book that I've been teaching, People's History, for quite a while, since I read it when I was an undergrad here. No matter what students' political viewpoints are, they're always marveled at the fact that they've never heard some of this stuff. I would imagine that they make similar comments about other versions of other histories in other classes, but they've never heard the information. And the responses are things like they feel cheated by their education, they feel lied to by previous teachers, and they then come out with a more questioning mannerism about anything that they take in.
Yeah.
Which should be encouraged. I encourage it with whatever I teach.
Sure.
If there is a benefit to teaching something like this, I think that would be the primary benefit.
That's an excellent point, and if I may, I just want to say two quick things sort of to follow up on that. One thing I neglected to mention, I think, is when Howard Zinn is sort of defending his own approach, one of the points he repeatedly makes is there's this mountain of books that go in another direction, and this is a little counterweight. So people say, oh, look, you go off in this biased direction where you're doing, you know, if that were like the only U.S. history book there were, you could maybe make that argument, but there's other things. And then another thing about objectivity, he has another locution where and this picks up on Robin's point about witnesses too, where he says maybe the best we can do for objectivity is enlarge the subjectivity. So you, instead of always hearing the point of view of the president and you get these sort of other people, that creates greater objectivity. Tony, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and this is sort of a commercial for the book, I've been listening to the book. There's other ways, you know, now with multimedia, it's the book. I think Audible has it for like $50 or $60, but you know, if you subscribe for 1 month, you get it for maybe even free, I don't know, but it would for at least $14, and then you can cancel it. I've been listening to, it's like, I don't know, like 20, 25 hours, the complete unabridged book, and it's great. It's, you know, you can get it in on your commute, and it's better than a lot of the talk radios.
Who narrates it?
I believe it's his son.
Oh, okay. Because his son is an actor, I think.
That must
Yeah,
be,
yeah,
it is, it's
yeah.
Zinn, this is.
Phyllis.
Just a quick technical thing. I noticed someone has been recording this. I'd like to ask where this is available. I know I have a number of other fellow educators who have expressed interest, but schedule conflicts.
Can you answer that for us, sir?
I think we'll be providing a link to someone in your
Okay.
Talk to me later, Phyllis.
Probably
Thank you.
either
Okay.
later today or tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Since I've heard from you, let me take a couple other people and maybe I can get back to you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I find it kind of interesting that you brought up about Mitch Daniels saying about where the books can be used and where they can't.
Yeah.
About 4 years ago, we had a program here on campus, and there was an 8th grader in one of the summer programs who was interested in history. And I had suggested she read Before the Mayflower, which she had read. And so I said, well, there's a people's history if you're ready to start looking at something different. She went right here in Hammond, tried to check the book out. They refused to let her check the book out.
At the Hammond Public Library?
The Hammond Public Library. And so now it all kind of comes together that this didn't just crop up overnight. This has been an ongoing way of keeping education in the hands of those who have something tangible that they're trying to get out of.
Well, that's an interesting, I hadn't heard anything like that.
Beg your pardon?
Can you call the show today?
Okay, yes, sir.
I'm so proud of my wife because one of the nicest things I ever told her when she was a teacher was when a student leaped to his feet and says, "That's the trouble with you, Mrs. Lundgren. All you want is the facts, the facts, the facts. The facts are my prejudices." She said, "That's the nicest thing you ever said to me."
Yes, sir.
Well, fortunately, Zinn's book isn't the only one of that category. It's William Appleton Williams.
Yes.
Surprised Mitch didn't mention him, probably doesn't know about him. There's also a book, and the author just escapes from a it's called The Lies My Teacher Told.
Oh, James Lowen.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
Lies My Teacher Told.
Yeah.
But about 2 decades ago, the American Historical Association did a comparison of how American-British relations are taught by American schools
Yeah.
and how they're taught in English schools. We think they were talking about countries on 2 different planets.
Yeah. If you're interested in that, there's a book I recommend. Unfortunately, I don't remember the author, but I can give you the title. It's called History Lessons. And what it is, it's a compendium of how U.S. history is presented in textbooks in other countries. So like all the events, like the American Civil War, what do they say about that in Norway and Japan? And it's quite revelatory. Like one of the things I learned in there, this is something from recent history, is that book shows that in most of the rest of the world, what we call globalization, the economic globalization, the rest of the world calls that Americanization. I didn't know that. I learned that from that book. Are there any other, please? Val.
Yeah, I would just note, I agree with Saul, of course, about for the rich, by the rich, but I think we need to be careful. I teach her as well. I think we need to be careful. I mean, there seems to be a lot of people here with the same opinion. I don't always like that. Almost everybody here seems to have the same opinion. We detest Mitch Daniels, we love Howard Zinn. We detest Mitch Daniels, we love Howard Zinn. We could start chanting it, I suppose. Well, because I agree. But I just say this. Saul said what he said, and I agree. But Saul has studied for 40 years. Howard Zinn studied for 40 years. Dave Detmer studied for 40 years. I studied for almost 40 years. So, in other words, if we say these things to our students about the state of our nation, we can't have them accept our argument from authority either.
Right.
In other words, if you want to know how corporations have a stranglehold on this country, and it's important that another generation knows it, well, they got to get off their butts, and they have to read very difficult Supreme Court cases. There's a reason corporate power exists in this country. It's in black and white. It's the law of the land. And it's difficult to understand it. It's time consuming. You have to put other things aside. And so I wouldn't want to leave this room with the idea that because a bunch of professors say so and a bunch of people here agree with them, that our nation is the way it is and Mitch Daniels is who he is and Howard Zinn is who he is. Well, I think those things are true. But we can't just pass it on to another generation because we say so, because we say so, because we say so. I mean, it takes time and effort to find these things out yourself, and I just would be hesitant to simply have students in my classes take it because I said so. I don't say anything in my classes. I give them things to read that are very hard to read and say, you figure it out for yourself. I like what you said, Juicy. I agree with you. I do. That's what made me think.
Well, can I just respond to that a little bit? I mean, obviously we don't want our students to take anything we say uncritically. And so in my teaching, I'm constantly saying that. Anytime I say anything, I say, look, If you disagree, speak right up. We need to discuss it. You must not just accept what I say on authority. You have to ask yourself, does it make sense? Does the argument make sense? And so on. But I don't know that I quite agree with the idea that a teacher shouldn't ever make an argument, because that's one other resource.
Oh, no, expose them to arguments.
Well, I know you're saying you're exposing, but can't you give them an argument too? Because you're right there. Somebody might say something, and you have something that would be really pertinent to what they just said, but it might mean you have to sort of present an argument. Now, you'd want to say, don't take it just because I'm the teacher, but here's an argument for you to weigh and consider. You don't have an objection to that, do you?
Yeah, I do.
You do? Why? What's the objection?
Because it's the argument from authority. I mean,
No, it's not. An argument from...
yes, I have, Dave. I've gone 6 years without giving an opinion in my class. 6 years in a row.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's an argument from authority. An argument from an authority has the structure of X is true because so-and-so says X is true.
I say the evidence speaks for itself.
Yeah.
If you want to read Citizens United and see why corporations have a grip on this power, then read it. Just don't say that I said it does.
Yeah.
I mean, read it yourself.
Well, yeah,
it's hard. It's difficult.
Sure, you want them to read it, absolutely.
No, not read it. They have to know it.
Okay. Yes, please.
I could say something that is basically coming between the two regarding this argument that I think, and I'll do it briefly, but that there is, I do agree with some merit to giving your argument in class as a professor, but also coming from, I've been teaching film and media, and there is some, you are an authority figure in that class, and you have to also weigh that your argument, hopefully, maybe, will have more weight than a student's argument, namely because there is some pressure to believe the professor so that the student can get a good grade.
Oh, yeah. Then all is lost if that's the motivation.
Well, I know, but there, I'm not saying not to, but there is we can't dismiss that professors are an authority figure.
Yeah.
And have power.
Yeah, it just seems to me it's going too far to then say professors shouldn't be part of the conversation, part of the exchange of ideas with students.
No,
yeah.
That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand.
There's a weight.
Yeah. No, that's a problem. There's no doubt about it. That is a problem. Eugene, did I see your hand? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
I mean, I don't think he's shutting down what you have to say as far as an argument. I think it's just more so. This is why we're in the situation in the first place, because we didn't go out and search and research and find the facts for ourselves. We just trusted what the professor had to say. So it's kind of, what the teacher had to say before we even got to the collegiate level. So,
I guess another thing I would say about that is that one of the nice things about having a job as a professor, it's one of the few positions you can have where you're able to articulate ideas where there's not very much pressure of any kind to be in line with corporate values, to go along with what Saul was saying. I mean, in the media, they tend to be, big corporations. In politics, there's all that corporate money and so on. So for professors to say, okay, I'm not going to give any opinions, I'm not going to give any arguments, let's have it be even more of a monopoly on the corporate message. So, that would be one thing I would say about that. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say that I'm an international management instructor, not here, but at another school. And one of my favorite quotes is that we learn nothing from those who see the world the same way we do. And I share that with my students as we talk about multicultural behaviors throughout the globe and all of those kinds of issues that come into play. So I've been listening to the televisions and the talk shows. These are people of the same mindset, and nothing new is learned.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd like to comment on the issue that was discussed about how the book was being censored in public libraries, and just the fact that people in general were just trying to get the book taken out of schools. And it made me question, why should there be such an institution on any kind of issue like that? Are we worried that our students can't think for themselves? I mean, the point of a public library and the point of academia is to create better thinkers, not just to train and trade so they can get a job. We want to make people better thinkers. So, I mean, we should put these different perspectives and different ideas so we can understand things better.
By the way, I might mention one of the ironies of this whole affair. There was an interesting article out of South Bend, of all places. So we're going quite a ways away from West Lafayette, that as a result of the publicity on this case, there was this huge demand for books by Howard Zinn, especially People's History, where it said they had something like 6 copies in their system, and they had to order 20 more, and now, you know, they have to order still more because it's back-ordered. And so there was an amusing article here in the student paper in the Chronicle by John Tiernan, another author, where he noted this, and he says, I'd like to call Mitch Daniels' attention to my book. And he starts sort of describing it, you know. Yes, sir.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say I read the book when I was a sophomore in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I just can't imagine that anybody would like not allow a kid to look at that, because like even now I have some criticisms of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it just kind of like opened up my mind, because before I thought history was just a bunch of different events.
Sure.
Without actually putting it in context.
You know, that's another point that we haven't talked about. Aside from the whole politics of it, another advantage of history from a point of view is it makes it more readable. A lot of these textbooks, because they're so desperate not to offend anyone and not to have any point of view, they're just bland and colorless. They don't go anywhere. Whereas if somebody's arguing for something, then it has, you know, tone and voice and narrative and all that kind of stuff. So that's an excellent point.